I have told this account 3 times in my teaching life. Once to a hall of second cycle cadets who laughed at the wrong moment. Once to a senior cohort who did not laugh at all, but asked questions I refused to answer. And once now, to you, to this class, on this particular morning. Because the Archival Council has recently begun discussing whether the Orressi file should be reclassified from sealed, destroyed, and I believe you should hear what is in it before that decision is made. I am telling you this not as legend. I am telling you this as record. The Orressi Communion was not a war-making body. I want that established plainly before anything else, because the assumption, when young minds hear of something that went wrong near the boundary, is that hubris was military in nature, that some admiral spoke too loudly and paid for it. Orressi Communion was 7 species joined by curiosity, scholars, cartographers, signal theorists, the kind of coalition that names its vessels after abstract nouns rather than weapons, the kind of coalition that debates methodology for 3 standard cycles before acting. They were not reckless people. They were thorough people. And I say it's not to excuse what they did, but to help you understand how even thorough people can fail to ask the one question that matters. The signal had been present in the long-range acoustic record for longer than the communion had existed as a body. It originated from deep inside the advisory margin, from a region that every responsible atlas has marked for as long as atlases have been kept, with the notation, passage not advised, reason archived, no return to inquire, a tmist narrow band, repeating, structured in a way that implied intent rather than accident. 7,211 pulses in a sequence that never varied, then silence for a fixed interval, then the sequence again, on and on, for as long as anyone had been listening. The Orressi signal theorists spent 4 cycles studying it before they voted. Their conclusion, reached by consensus, was that the signal was old. Older than the advisory margin itself. Older perhaps than the notation that warned ships away. They concluded it was a relic, an automated transmission from some early human installation, still cycling because no one had returned to switch it off. A kind of lighthouse, they said, left burning in an empty harbor. They voted to reply. I have read their deliberation transcripts. I have read them several times, looking for the moment when someone asked the obvious question. The question is, if the signal had been cycling without interruption for that long, what had it been cycling through? What had it been broadcasting into? And what had those broadcasts accumulated into over that span of time? No one in the transcripts asks this. The debate is thorough on every other axis. Transmission format, distance calculation, response encoding, political sensitivity of approaching the margin at all. On the question of what the signal had been doing all that time, in that particular sector, the transcripts are silent. They built a relay chain, 12 unmanned stations positioned at intervals from the outer edge of the communion's territory to a point just inside the advisory margin. Not crossing it, they noted carefully in the mission record, merely approaching. The probe itself would cross. The relay chain would carry the response back. The probe was small, elegant. It carried a compressed archive of Orressi mathematics, stellar cartography, biological notation, a formal introduction, encoded in the same base structure as the signal itself. They had been meticulous about matching the signal's own grammar. If the source was an automated human system, it might recognize the response format. If it was monitored by something awake, the format would communicate respect. Fury, the East, launched the probe on the 3rd day of the 7th cycle of the 42nd Standard Reckoning. I remember the date not because I memorized it, but because it is the date stamped on the first entry in the Orressi file, the entry that records the launch in the flat, satisfied language of scientists who believe they have done something careful and correct. Probe crossed the advisory margin at estimated transit hour 19. At transit hour 23, the signal stopped, not faded, interrupted, stopped. 7,211 pulses and then nothing, mid-sequence, between the 4,002nd pulse and the 4,003rd. The communion's listening stations noted the cessation immediately. The record shows a brief period of uncertainty. Instrument error was proposed, cross-checked, and ruled out within 2 hours. Signal had simply ceased. At the moment the probe came within, what they later calculated was close contact range of the source. They interpreted this as contact, as success. The automated system, they theorized, recognized an incoming response and paused its broadcast to listen. This is in the record. They were pleased. Probe continued transmitting its introduction. Its signal came back clearly through the relay chain for another 11 hours. Then the probe signal also stopped. The communion's response, again, I am reading from the record, was to wait. Equipment failure was the leading hypothesis. They waited 30 hours, then 60. The probe did not resume transmitting. They ran diagnostics on the relay chain. All 12 stations were functioning. Something at the far end of the chain had simply ceased. On the fourth day after the probe went silent, the outermost relay station, the one position deepest inside the advisory margin, stopped, responding to status pings. No distress signal, no final log entry, no transmission of any kind. It was simply there in one status cycle and absent in the next. The communion convened an emergency session. There are voices in the audio record of that session that I find difficult to listen to even now. Not because they are panicked, but because they are so carefully not panicked. Disciplined people working very hard to find an explanation that does not require them to consider certain other explanations. They voted to send a retrieval team to the outermost relay station. Retrieval vessel reached the station's last recorded position and found nothing. No debris, no residue, no gravitational anomaly to account for the absence. The station was simply gone, in the way that something is gone when it has been removed rather than destroyed. Over the following 9 days, the relay chain went dark from the inside out, station by station, outermost to innermost, always in the same status cycle pattern, present in one ping, absent in the next, no signals, no debris, no transition. The communion evacuated their border-adjacent facilities during this period. When the innermost station, positioned well outside the advisory margin, well within what any reasonable observer would have considered safe territory, disappeared on the 9th day, the communion's remaining ships were already in retreat. The Galactic Archival Council received the communion's report 42 days after the probe's launch. The council's session notes from that review are themselves sealed, but I am an elder of this institution, and I have read them. The deliberation lasted 6 hours. The conclusion, recorded in 4 lines, was as follows. The Orressi Communion's action represented the most thoroughly documented approach to the advisory margin in recorded history. Their methodology was sound. Their caution was genuine. And the outcome did not vary from the outcome of every other approach that had ever been recorded, careful or otherwise. The advisory margin was extended outward. The new boundary absorbed the positions of all 12 relay stations and a considerable volume of space beyond them. The Orressi file was sealed. What I have not told you, what the public record does not contain, is the final entry in the Orressi file. It was made by the communion's last signals officer, from a vessel already 17 hours into retreat, monitoring the relay chain as it went dark. The entry is brief. She notes the disappearance of the 11th station. She notes that she has been monitoring the full spectrum, not only the relay frequencies, but all of them, and that since the 9th day, since the first station disappeared, she has been receiving a transmission on the original signal's frequency. The same base grammar, the same narrow band, but the sequence is different. It is not 7,211 pulses. It is a different number, and unlike the original signal, it is not repeating. It is counting down. She does not record what number it started at. It's only that at the time of her final entry, whatever it had started at, it was smaller. The file ends there. I'm telling you this because the council is considering destruction rather than continued seal, and before that vote is taken, I believe the record should be spoken aloud by someone who has read it, to people who have not. You are those people. You are, as of this morning, among the small number of minds in this institution who know what the Orressi Communion found when they answered. I will not be taking questions about the countdown. I do not know what it reached. I do not know if it is finished. I do not know what finishing means. What I know is this. The signal had been broadcasting into that sector for a very long time. The communion sent something in, something noticed, and whatever noticed is not, as far as the record shows, broadcasting outward. It is not needed to. The advisory margin holds because nothing that crosses it ever comes back to argue otherwise. The Orressi Communion was the most careful body to ever approach that line. They were careful the way scholars are careful, completely, and not quite carefully enough. The file will be voted on in 30 days. I have said what I came to say. Class is dismissed.